Welcome everyone to today's episode of the A to Z speaker series, where we bring in leading experts to discuss future careers for your child. And today we are delighted to introduce you to Alistister Files from IE University. He is the Vice Dean of Behavioural Science at the Spanish University, and today he's going to look at the use of psychology and behavioural science in the world of work for the next decade. Okay, so welcome, Alistair. Please go ahead with your presentation. Thank you.
Lovely. Thank you very much, Gordon, and thank you everybody for joining us today. As Gordon was saying, my name is Dr. Alistair Files, and I am the head of behavioural science here in IE University here in Spain. Prior to coming to Spain, I worked as a consultant for many years, basically seeking to understand human behaviour using a variety of different ways of doing that, using different lenses: psychology, economics, sociology, but also trying to find ways of changing human behavior as well, generally in risky environments, whether in law enforcement or in national security. So I spent many years using this. That was also what my doctorate was on. And now I work in behavior change and behavioral science here in Madrid in Spain. But what I'd like to do today is to talk a little bit about what we see the next decade looking like for your children, the Generation Z that are currently arriving. But before we do that, I'd like to help you understand about how psychology and behavioral science are going to help us understand what Gen Z are going to be dealing with in the next 10 years, and also how they can better protect themselves and live more happier and more productive lives as well. So very simply, here at IE University, I run a bachelor program called the Bachelor in Behaviour and Social Sciences. One of the elements that we do there is giving people an understanding of all the different disciplines. That can be economics, sociology, psychology. Now, the psychology and behavioural science, I'm going to tell you a little bit about that because that will help you understand some of the concepts that we'll talk about a little bit later. So very simply, what we do in our first year, and what I'm currently doing with my first years now, is giving them a different understanding of there are different lenses that you can apply to understand human behavior. So if you look at something with a psychological lens, you will see what certain types of explanation about why people do what they do. But an economist will see very different things about why people do what they do. Now, so if we understand, one of the kind of core understandings that a lot of us have about why people do what they do is very much based on an economic model, the idea that people are rational, that we make choices based on our evaluation of costs and benefits. For those of you who have teenagers, you probably have to think about how you get them to do homework and what are the costs and benefits that you have to negotiate with them, probably on a daily basis, to actually get them to do what they need to do. So that's the kind of more economic view. But there are more concrete and there are more applicable understandings that we're actually finding in the world when it's beyond an economics and actually thinking about how people's psychology affects their decisions. So these are a lot of the elements of psychology are things that are below our subconscious, that we're not really aware of them, but they kind of drive our behavior. Now, where one of the main areas that's really expanded over the last 15 years is this concept called behavioral science. It's basically taking this economic view of why people do what they do, about costs and benefits, and marrying it with psychology about what are these underlying mental processes that we might not even be aware of, and how these two meet together and how they actually affect our decision making as well. So what behavioral science is seeking to do is looking at how biases and mental shortcuts help us actually make decisions, and also how we can actually use these to positively change behavior. Now, why behavioral science has become so powerful is that it's been giving us a new understanding of why we do what we do, but also understanding as a human being that we make consistent errors on how we evaluate risk, about how we evaluate information, about how our attention isn't particularly strong. And all of these things are common amongst all of us. And if we want to make better decisions, we need to start considering these kind of elements as well. So that's what we do here on the Bachelor in Behavior, but also these elements are really going to have an impact not only now on Gen Z, on your children, but also in the future as well. So, how do people actually use psychology and behavioral science now in the workplace? There are two main elements: management of others and then the management of the self. So, if you were to go and work into an organization, these are typically people who work in a talent or an HR function. They would be making inroads in terms of learning and development. How do you change a behavior here to a behavior here? But also in things also like in leadership and executive coaching as well. So people need this understanding of psychology and how people make decisions to enable them to manage people more effectively. But we also see in terms of how people are becoming increasingly aware of how they manage themselves in terms of psychotherapy, in terms of coaching, also this concept of well-being and mental health that has become such a big issue over the last 10 years, which has also been exacerbated by COVID as well. So typically, these are the type of areas that people with this psychology or behavioral science background would work in. They would seek to help people manage others or find giving them the skills and the knowledge to help them manage themselves. But as we have come out of COVID and we now have things like Gen AI, we now have these forms of instant communication, the new working world has arrived, and there is going to be an impact not just on our behavior, but in how we manage our work as well. So I'm wanting to bring out three key trends which we are seeing that I'm sure many of you working as professionals already see within your working day, but also explore how Gen Z are going to manage those further as well. So first, we have the speed and ease of communication. We have productivity metrics, and we also have the need for faster output using Gen AI. So what do we mean by that? This might look very familiar to you. This is Slack. For those of us who use Slack, or some of us use Teams, instant messaging at work, the issue that we have is that now with the proliferation of these tools enabling us to communicate instantaneously, but also get contact with anybody that we would want in a matter of seconds, the issue that's then becoming is that we're adopting an always on mentality to work. Gone are the days, maybe 30 years ago, where our parents or ourselves, when we were starting our careers, we would go, we would do our job, we would close our computer, and we would have no more contact with our working world or with people at work until we went back the next day. Now, we have these devices, we have them on our phones, we have the apps on our phones, we can be reachable at any point, day or night, in the weekend as well. Now, that's fantastic for productivity to a degree, but it's also our ability to disconnect from work also has a psychological effect on our mental health and our well-being as well. So this is something not only I think many of us are actually dealing with, the constant notifications from work, but also our children are having to deal with this as well. Second, we have productivity metrics. So many of us and our children who decide to go into university will become knowledge workers, as in they will have certain skills or knowledge that makes them rare in the economic and the job marketplace, and that becomes their capital in which they get money for and they get a salary for. The challenge that we have is that with knowledge workers, like many of us are, it's very difficult to measure our productivity. So gone are the days where 50, 60 years ago, if I was working to build a car, I would have certain productivity metrics. How many screws I put into the car, how many cars I finish by the end of the day. With knowledge workers, it's much more difficult. It's much more difficult to say, like, what have we actually done? But with many organizations, they're looking at productivity metrics and they're using quite crude metrics. How many meetings have you been to? How many calls have you done? How many leads have you contacted? So these are the things that are then driving certain types of behavior, which are prioritizing immediate rewards, as in, I need to book X amount of meetings or I need to speak to X amount of people, rather than the quality of work as well. And this is an effect that we're also going to see with Gen Z. And then the third, which is something that we're all becoming familiar with, is that the impact of generative AI and the amount of tools that we can just see just in this circle here is that this enabling us to produce faster output. Gone are the days where if I have to sit down and write a project plan, it might take me 3 or 4 hours. Now I can literally put it into a Gen AI and at least get a first draft of a project plan within 30 seconds. So that's enabling us to be more productive, but also sometimes at the expense of originality as well. So these more elements, the ease of communication, productivity metrics, and also the ability to generate faster output is not only what we're seeing in the working world today, but it is going to have an impact on the younger generation. But that's about the working world now, but there are broader trends that we are seeing with Gen Z that are going to have affect their ability to do quality work. And this is where psychology and behavioral science can come in to try to help manage these qualities as well. So came out last year, 86% of our time awake is spent consuming information. Now, that information can be active in terms of us reading something on our phone or responding to an email, but it can also be passive. How many of us maybe listen to podcasts, listen to audiobooks, so we are passively taking in this information. But the ability of our brains to soak and process this information is also becoming more and more difficult. And this is especially difficult for knowledge workers because our capital in the marketplace is what we know. So where a lot of us think is the more information I have, the more knowledge I have, the better I'll be able to do my job. But the challenge then becomes is that our brains are not wired to take in such an exponential increase in the total amount of information that we are consuming on an everyday basis. Now, this is where we are now. 80% of our time awake is spent consuming information based on 40% in 1980. You would imagine that that will increase even further as time goes on and the barriers to information continue to decrease through social media, through the sharing of information, through Gen AI producing a summary of whatever topic you may want. But let's think about Gen Z. This is a report that was done a year ago, looking at their screen time and the habits globally in terms of Gen Z and their uses of devices. On average, and this is a global consumer, so this is around the world that we're looking at, 109 days a year are looking at a screen. Now, if we think back to the introduction of the iPhone in 2008, that was 16 years ago, and now we are seeing such a massive change in behavior in terms of everything mediated through a screen. As many of you have teenagers, I'm sure this is something that you have to deal with on a daily basis, but this is within 2 generations, behavior is completely changed, and there are some very real consequences of these elements as well. One of the real elements is actually looking about how much time Gen Z is actually spending time building meaningful relationships. So if we have a look at the graph on the right, which comes from a recently published article, looking at the amount of time that was spent socializing with friends, look at 2012, so that was 4 years after the introduction of the iPhone, and when smartphones became more and more popular, you can see there's been a precipitous drop in terms of all generations, but in particular Gen Z, who are in the age of the 15 to 24 bracket, in terms of how much time they are actually spending with each other, and also then the effect on them actually building meaningful relationships with friends and family and these kind of elements as well. So this kind of change is being very dramatic, even just over a period of a decade. And also the final thing as well, there's a very good book written about 5 years ago looking at how life expectancy is expected to change over the decades and what are the effects and consequences of that, called The 100-Year-Old Life. One of the most striking things I took from reading this book was that Gen Z will not only live longer, but they're going to work more years than previous generations. So if we have a look at the bar chart on the right-hand side, is that the oldest age at which 15% of babies born in 2007 are predicted to still be alive. So what we're looking at there is that there is a 1 in 2 chance people will live to beyond 100. Our sons and daughters will live until that point. Now, that raises many questions, but the main impact is the idea that they will retire at 65 or whatever the legal age is in whichever country you're from, is very unlikely to be the case by the time they get to the ages of 60 or 70. They are going to have to plan and they're going to have to manage themselves physically, mentally, and emotionally to have a longer working life and to be more consistent in that time as well, because they are going to live longer than you and I, and this they're going to have to make plans to enable them to be more effective and to have a more meaningful and productive life at that point. So, in summary, Gen Z, your teenagers, your sons, your daughters, they are more likely to live longer. They're going to work more years. They're going to continue to be exposed to increasing amounts of information, and they're also using less time to build meaningful relationships. Now, this might sound like common sense, but a lot of the psychological evidence shows that a key predictor of positive mental health is the ability to create and maintain a community of meaningful relationships. So it's not just this need that we all have to be friends with people and to communicate and to feel part of something. It actually has very real effects on people's ability to resist mental health difficulties. And then with final thing, as we're all conscious of, especially with devices, we're at the mercy of products and services that wish to displace their attention. So when I was writing this presentation, I felt, well, this is a very depressing picture on what the world could look like. But what I want to give you here is some points of positivity, but also some very real actions that you can take with your sons and daughters to help them think about the future, but also productively manage it as well. So what can we actually do with these elements? So here's what I would say is the Gen Z to-do list. This is something that you can do now with young people, with the sons and daughters to help prepare them for the future. First, it's very clear that, especially with devices and social media, is that they have turned the ability to grab, maintain your attention in not just into an art, but they've turned it into a science. And so their ability for somebody to drag themselves away from looking at TikTok or looking at social media, or even for some of us looking at Teams or emails as well, it's becoming more and more difficult. And these products and services are not going to help us distance ourselves away from their products, because they are invested in us using the products as much as as we possibly can. So it's actually going to put the responsibility on the individual to actively protect their attention. So what I mean by this is 15 years ago, the mental health and the well-being agenda started to become something people were becoming more aware of in a work context, that we needed to take positive steps in terms of nutrition, sleep, positive well-being, positive relationships with others. And now what we will see is pretty much in most working environments, people are focused and they are willing to talk about mental health and well-being. My view is, based on the research and based on current trends, is we will have to start seeing our ability to protect our attention in the same way and then give it in the same importance as our mental health and our well-being as well. Why? Because if you want people to think critically and creatively about the information and knowledge that they receive, they need to do a couple of things. One, they need to be able to maintain their attention, and two, they need to minimize information overload. So earlier I talked about that 80% of our waking hours were about consuming information. I'm sure some of us might feel that we take in so much information, whether it's active or passive, that sometimes we're just unable to think. And that inhibits our ability to think critically about the information that we receive, but also to think creatively about different ways of doing things as well. So these are things that we are going to have to proactively manage, not only as professionals now, but also help our sons and daughters also manage these things as well, in maintaining and seeing their attention as a finite resource. It's not something that they can be expected to do at 10 o'clock at night. I'm sure many of you have tried to help your child do homework at 9 o'clock at night. They have to do it by the next day. Their attention isn't there. It's because their attention is a finite resource. And so what we need to do is to help them start treating it like a finite resource as well. But also, I talked also about the amount of time that young people were spending building meaningful relationships with friends. One of the key elements and is also their interpersonal skills in terms of building and creating communities, whether those are family, friends, at work, whatever, or by interests, whatever they may be. The reason why this is important is not only we as human beings are social beings, and now we have devices which can separate us from the world outside and our ability to make meaningful connections, is that for many people, they, as working professionals, they are going to not only be working longer, but they're going to be changing roles, changing sectors, changing countries much more frequently than previous generations, because the barriers to entry to changing these roles, sectors, or locations are reducing over time. So we need to focus even more on people becoming adaptable and more resilient to those changes, but also having the interpersonal skills is that wherever they go, that they can adapt to that environment by talking to people, by making friends with people, and by making the most of that and avoiding isolation from those kind of things. So how we not just build their interpersonal skills, but how we also help them consciously create and maintain a community face to face will become even more important as well. So you might say, okay, that sounds nice, but where are the jobs going to be in that next decade if they were to use some of these skills? So we talked about management of others and management of self. So we always have elements around talent in HR that are using these kind of elements as well. But I think there will have to be more conscious elements of team and leadership development. And that's where the interpersonal skills and the empathy skills really come in, is that the people who are more able to manage teams and the people who are more able to lead have to have finely tuned interpersonal skills, and that's what they need to consciously develop as well. The second element is if we understand attention is a finite resource and it is our ability to think critically and creatively about things that will help us be more productive and produce value and also produce something more meaningful us as human beings, we will have to have organizational and service designers that treat our attention as preciously as mental health and as well-being and as productivity currently are as well. And that will require people with a behavioral science and a psychological knowledge to help them design those elements. And then the third element is we already have people working in psychology, people working in therapy as well, but also it will become even more keen as people are working longer and as they may be moving sectors and roles more frequently than the past, they will need the mental and the psychological support to help them make those changes as well. So these kind of elements will continue to grow. And in terms of management itself, what we're currently seeing, and we certainly see this within business schools around the world, is more personalized coaching for high performers to redesign their working habits. It is no longer just about being productive in work or consistent in work. What's just as important are the habits of nutrition, sleep, and performance you have outside of your work that have that impact as well. So helping them prolong their working life by helping them understand how their brain makes decisions and make better decisions to elongate their longevity as well. And then the final one is this would probably be more of an extension of our coach. If we understand that we all have biases, we all sometimes not make the greatest decisions as well, we're probably going to have to look at coaching extending to something like a life designer in terms of what does your ideal life look like? How do you proactively protect your attention? How do you plan for a longer working life? Where for many of us, the welfare state will not provide to the same degree of generosity as they currently do in terms of pensions or 401ks and those kind of elements. But also, how do we actually maintain a healthy community so that we can have a meaningful life, not only for our families, but for our friends and other communities that we contact as well? So may sound like a lot of information, but there are what's key to me, having looked at the evidence and also thinking about the future as well, psychology and our understanding of how we're making decisions is going to become even more important as attention becomes a finite resource and our sons and daughters live longer and then have to become more adaptable to the circumstances that they face. I'd like to say thank you very much for your time, and we'll be back in a moment to answer any questions.
Many thanks for that session. You indeed had my attention throughout that presentation. So thank you very much. It was a really interesting take for us in terms of looking, from a broader picture in terms of, what individuals will be faced with in the future, especially living longer, potentially working longer, and looking at those different skills that they'll need to be able to cope, not just with a career, but with, multiple careers as well. Thank you very much. We are joined today with Alistair Files. He is the Vice Dean of Behavioural Science at IE University over there in Madrid. So thank you very much for joining us today. Really interested in your topic in particular, in terms of behavioural sciences. Could you tell me a little bit more about, how did you get your interest in this area? How did you become the Vice Dean of Behavioural Sciences?
No, thank you for the question, Gwar. So I was somebody that had a curiosity about why people do what they do. And for the first element of that was one, trying to understand why people make the decisions that they do, but then also that's not enough. It would also be trying to find out how can you change that behavior to make people happier and more productive. We've all had a conversation with a loved one or a family member or a friend, and they ask us, they're telling us about something terrible that's happened, and you give them advice, but they don't take it for whatever reason. That's what I sought to apply in my academic life. So I did my PhD in behavior change, trying to change police behavior towards the public in trying to encourage compliance by helping people feel like they were actually trying to help them rather than using more force. So I applied some of those lessons in a variety of different environments, but then became even more passionate that we seem to, as human beings, to be making the same mistakes and again, especially when our emotions are involved. And it seemed to be become even more important to me as a human being as well as a professional is how can we capture some of this knowledge and give it to a wider group of people to help them have more meaningful and more productive lives. And so now at IE University here in Madrid, I seek to apply some of those lessons in terms of what we teach on the program that I run, but also more broadly in terms of behavioral science.
Okay, it's a really interesting topic, and I guess it's not something you would necessarily come across at an early age in a primary year discussion with parents. But you did strike on a key area, I think, that helped you identify this as a potential career later on, and the fact that you do enjoy helping people and that you were interested in behaviours. What would you say to parents with children that might have interest in, a related area to behavioral science? How would they identify it to start off with?
As a really good question. For me, how would you identify it? I see it in the students, and I say to them, you either have the curiosity about yourself, about why you do what you do, or you have a curiosity around the world around you. You see people making decisions you might not agree with, but instead of rejecting them for that decision, you're like, that's curious. Tell me more. Tell me more is probably one of the greatest questions that you can ask somebody that you disagree with, because what it's what it positions you as is like, I'm not just going to shout back at you about why you have the wrong opinion. Tell me more about that, and trying to get through a position of empathy, trying to understand what this person is telling you rather than saying, well, my opinion is completely different. Then you have a much richer conversation with people, and with the conversations with people that on first glance you might have nothing in common with, but ultimately we're all human beings, and there should be that attempt to actually try to understand people's point of view. So to answer your question, Gore, how do people start to explore that? It's sometimes, and which is difficult with teenagers who are establishing their identity, is instead of becoming an oppositional force to something that they say or that they interact with somebody that they might not agree with, it's like, why don't you try this question? Ask them to tell them more about that. And why do you think that way? And explore it a bit more. And if that's something that they naturally gravitate to, that's probably something they would probably like to explore further.
Okay. Is there a common misunderstanding about this topic in terms of behavioral science and um, potentially future careers in behavioral science, or just misunderstandings in general?
The classic one is you'll be a mind reader, which is you're like a clinic. If you become a psychologist, you're reading people's minds. I think most people understand that's not what it is. Um, or that people will be uncomfortable in a conversation with you because they think you're analyzing them, and you probably are, to be honest. But who nobody likes to be watched, do they? And if so, that can make somebody feel quite uncomfortable. So then it becomes more about having a conversation and showing interest in them and not seeming like you're profiling them. So I think a misunderstanding can be that um, you're fitting people into categories, and that's not really what it is. It the way the more productive way and the more positive way is saying is like, no, I'm wanting to understand people and understand why people do what they do. I think that's probably the main element.
Okay, that's interesting. And looking specifically, so you've got this slide here about management. There's management of self, and the kind of roles, the kind of traditional roles that individuals can go into with a focus on behavioral science.
Mm.
What about, in 10, 20 years' time? You mentioned that obviously they'll be working longer, for longer. Um, what will affect these industries? The transformation of technologies, living longer, going into different careers. What would you
Mm.
say would be the most, what will impact these industries and the careers in this industry the most in the future?
So my view is that 60 years ago, you would become a specialist in a particular area. You could be a chemist, you could be a psychologist, whatever it may be. Um, but the barriers to becoming a specialist um, are falling down. Why are they falling down? Because we have things like Gen AI now, which can produce summaries of any form of knowledge or information that you would ever want, and that the potential is for these types of tools to take away a lot of the time that you would normally invest in really understanding a topic, and that's basically reducing the need for that particular specialism, especially now as well economically. We people are companies and organizations are competing globally. They're not just competing in their particular country, which means that things can move on very quickly. This is going to age this presentation, but last week we had DeepSeek, which was a Chinese AI um, bot that came out, and basically now there's a lot of AI companies in America incredibly worried that they've spent billions of dollars, and this company can actually do it a lot cheaper. So that's an example where everybody thought it was going to be one thing and we invest all our time, and now it needs to become something else. But the key element is that going back to being a specialist, the idea of being a specialist is not going to last for decades. A person is going to have to become more adaptable because the needs of the market and the needs of organizations are going to change quicker, and thus it becomes even more important that people can manage that uncertainty. Is that I'm working in this company and now it no longer exists and now I need to move into something else. So they need to manage that uncertainty. They need to also manage what gives them value in the job market, which is their ability to think critically, their ability to connect with people, and their ability to think creatively as well. So it's these kind of more psychological elements that are going to help distinguish them in the job market in terms of managing all of that uncertainty, but also being seen as valuable as well.
Yeah, and that's a great summary of some of the kind of characteristics and qualities and skills that they will need to cope with future change and transformation as well. Critical thinking, self leadership in a way, and self discipline in terms of their attention. Where they are they able to not spend 109 days on a screen per year, for example, but also kind of building relationships and that kind of communication piece there as well. Okay, so if you were to give one key piece of advice to parents, about behavioral science, about future careers, what would that be?
So one where behavioral science is particularly used right now is in marketing, especially in finance and financial technical companies. So your app has been redesigned, your Santander app or your Royal Bank of Scotland app, and they want you to press on certain buttons. They have used behavioral science, knowing how your mind works to make sure that you're more likely to press on one button than another. So the key element behind all of those is about experimentation, about trying different things and seeing which ones actually work. So what I would be, if I was a parent who had a child that seemed to be interested in this type of topic, I would be encouraging their curiosity about and seeing what's in the digital world and the things that they interact with, and trying to take a step back from them and thinking about, why am I compelled to press this button? Why am I compelled to watch one more reel? Why am I compelled to save a bit more money or to spend money on this kind of element? And once you start to recognize that companies are using behavioral science to use their services more, or to pay more money, or to save more money sometimes as well in financial technology, then you can understand how you are being influenced by factors outside of your control, and you're being by their knowledge of the brain as well. So it would be more, the first step I would take would be Black Friday. Everything is discounted by 20-25%. I would ask your son and daughter, why do you think they've discounted that by 25%? The answer is that they want you to anchor on the high price, and now you're getting the price is 25% less, and now you feel like you have a bargain because it's more valuable. So that's an example of where they're using your brain and how your brain evaluates value to get you to buy something. So I would use that example, Black Friday, anything with a heavy discount, anything like that, and say, why does that discount make you want it more? And that can lead to an interesting conversation.
Well, that's fantastic advice there. And it's great to hear an expert like yourself validate some of the messages that we commit to our ISP as well, in terms of sparking curiosity and building curious and confident minds amongst the ISP students. So thank you very much for your time. It was really interesting. There's a lot of takeaways there, a lot of things to think about as well in terms of the future and the behavior of Gen Z and what they might have to cope with as well. So thank you very much.
No, thank you very much, Gwar, for your time.